Thanks a lot. Okay. Shall I start by talking about the one thing I wasn't actually planning on talking about today, but because it's been raised early, IPv6. Hands up who actually wants us to deploy IPv6? Yep, okay. There's a few hands coming up, okay. This is not me launching a new product, okay, but we are working very, very hard on being able to do IPv6. We're looking at dual stacking a large number of our edge boxes to make sure that customers can have a native session. And I'm hoping that that's going to be market ready Q1 of next year. But we realize, and we see an awful lot of RFPs that basically say, this is now not a joke. We need you to have this. And I think it's always been a very European-focused issue from our perspective. I just think our American customers are a little bit behind on it, but they're starting to pick up pace as well. And so, as they do so, it puts us, in a very powerful position of making sure that, we can do the whole global network at once. So, I'm Andrew Haynes, and I'm the product manager responsible for our wholesale high-speed IP network in Europe, the Middle East, and Africa. And what I'm going to talk about today is really aimed at ISPs, but it's also important, I think, for content companies and for e-commerce companies, because it's about the way that we see this industry evolving and some of the issues that I think all of you are going to have as traffic volumes continue to increase. So I'm going to start out with a little bit of an introduction of our business, and the reason for doing that is actually not purely commercial, but actually because it tells a story. And then I'm going to look a little bit at where we hit certain walls and some of the approaches that different networks have tried to use to be able to solve those issues, and some of the problems with them, and hopefully a couple of potential alternative solutions. And I'm going to do this a little bit multimedia, a little bit more multimedia than I intended to. There's a video in the middle of this which I couldn't embed in PowerPoint. Unfortunately, that goes to show that I'm not very technically capable. And also apologies for the fact that I'm clearly not speaking in Polish, but I couldn't learn it on the plane. And I'm also going to try and use the Blackboard, if I could do, as it dawned on me as I sat on the plane, that there were a couple of slides that maybe I hadn't written, but as we're in an academic environment, I'm inspired to try and use the chalkboard because it's been years since I sat in a lecture room like this. So let's start a little bit with the history of Level 3. Level 3 is actually an older company than 1997. The legacy business is actually a construction company, and it actually spent a large amount of time digging up roads, usually for civil engineering projects. Our CEO had a background in building and selling networks and approached the company that was Level 3 before, which was called Peter Hewitt Diversified. Also owned a coal mine. No one really understands why, but we still own it. We're not using it to power our colo facilities. In 1997, we really changed from the construction company to a network company, and raised the largest amount of money that had ever been raised in an IPO before. And in fact, the total amount of money spent from 1997 to now by us and all the companies we've acquired is over $27 billion. We own our own transatlantic capacity. We used to have an Asian network, had to pull out of that at the height of the dot-com boom, well, at the height of the dot-com bust, should I say. And the phases were in 97 through to 2000, to be honest. We were still building. We're building in the US mainly. We also built what we call Ring 1 and Ring 2. I think most companies also call them Ring 1 and Ring 2. It goes around Paris, Amsterdam, Frankfurt, Düsseldorf. Our Ring 2 goes up to Berlin. And from 2001 to 2002, I guess we hit the same issues that everyone else in the industry did. We're very proud. We believe, the only company of our size that didn't actually file for Chapter 11. This is a point of great pride to our CEO, to say that we have continued to make sure that we deliver on the original promises that we made to our shareholders and to our bondholders. And we've never wavered from that. So from 98 to 2000, life was good, although, let's be honest, if you look back historically, the revenues were pretty small. 2001 to 2002, we dealt with a lot of change, as everybody did. And in Europe, we went from, I think, at peak 2,500 employees to around about 200. But we didn't, as I said, we never turned off the lights. We kept on going. As we came into 03 and 04, bandwidth demand started to pick up again. And we'd originally started, right, this is all built fundamentally as dug infrastructure colo, our own buildings, our own power supplies, all that sort of stuff. Selling transport, selling fiber to competitors. A habit I've never entirely understood in telecoms companies, but there it is. And then on top of that transport infrastructure, and you can kind of see it in the name, the idea of Level 3 was originally to build a ubiquitous IP network. Right? So from 01 to 02, we filled the network not only in IP but also in transit. Post-bubble agility is really 03 to 04 doing really well. 05 to 06, we started putting a lot more work into expanding our business model. And what we did in the US is we bought a whole bunch of different regional companies, massively increasing our footprint, also entered us into the enterprise space. And in Europe, we started expanding outside of Ring 1 and Ring 2. We added our southern ring down to Spain. We added rings around Central and Eastern Europe, went out to Vienna. And in 07 and 08, this is my one Polish phrase, dzień dobry, I hope I said that vaguely correctly, was when we entered the Warsaw market. And as many of you will know, we're in the LIM building at the moment, and we're looking to expand. I'll talk about that in a moment. 07 to 08, we started expanding beyond just IP. And started thinking about what is the future of internet and what are the other tools that we need to bring to the market to be able to bring a converged video, transport, entertainment, communications paradigm into being. And in 09, we're starting to see that vision come into reality. So I'll talk a little bit about some of the base levels because I think they're important, and particularly as this is a technological conference. I myself am also not very technical, so I may stumble over a little bit of this, but fundamentally the Level 3 approach and the way that we built, and you can see that engineering background in the infrastructure we deployed, was we dug our own routes. As a general rule, we would drop 8 to 12 conduits in each of those routes, all buried, make sure that every entrance into every building is at least diverse, sometimes triverse, laterals, minimal network spurs, was the fundamental ethos. Physical and electronic diversity, everything is, 2 power supplies, 2 sets of batteries, 2 sets of DWDM equipment, 2 sets of routers on the backbone, 2 sets of core switches between them, 2 sets of, on and on and on. It costs a lot, this stuff, doesn't it? We also looked at dual gateway designs, and we try to, in our largest markets, try and make sure that we actually have more than one gateway. And as I said, actually at the moment in Warsaw, we're looking at bringing a second pop-up that will be entirely diverse of transport layer from the LIM location. Again, hoping that's going to be around about Q1 2010. It's all buried for the most part. There are occasions where we expand and we have to lease bits, and there's always a few little bits that we'd all rather weren't sitting in aerial or whatever else. But as a general rule, I think across almost all of Level 3 networks globally now, there is almost no aerial routes. And as I said, multiple fiber conduits. Try again. So on top of that transit network, or transport network, right, we went into the IP business at the same time. And we've grown and grown and grown and grown and grown. And as we stand at the moment, and this is from, I think, June in 2009, you'll notice we only have a North American and European network, but we are currently ranked, according to Renesys, the #1 global provider in terms of number of primary routes announced. I'm sure most of you are relatively familiar with the Renesys approach to measuring size of network. It's the number of prefixes, effectively. And what's interesting, and what I like as a trend, but suspect we'll need to spend more money to maintain it, is even in Asia, we're the #1 carrier where we don't actually have any infrastructure at all. And that's down to Asian carriers connecting back to our network either on the Pacific coast at one of the cable landing stations, or increasingly, we've got a number of Middle Eastern and African and even subcontinent providers connecting to us in places like Marseille, where they buy their own transport, usually because they're members of cable consortiums, buy their own transport back to Europe and then connect in to the Level 3 network, AS3356. So that's a great story, and we're very proud of it, but it only goes so far. Another manifestation of the size of the network, or another way of measuring it, if you will, is the fewest AS hops. Fixed orbit runs an analysis, and we are 1.73 hops. This was, again, June. June was a very busy month for us updating our collateral. The 1.73 hops, I think our next nearest competitor was 1.84 hops at Global Crossing. And the point of this, I guess, is, #1, extensive connectivity. And it also means that obviously the traffic is much more likely to, leap ahead, traffic is much more likely to stay on net between any 2 different locations, right? So in terms of internet users and people on our network, 19 of the 20 top 20 telecom carriers, 9 of the 10 largest telecom providers in Europe, 9 of the 10 largest US ISPs. It gets a little bit boring after a while to read this. This is why I took out our slide about SLAs once I tried to read all the way across the 9s and it got a bit dull. What does this mean in Europe? In Europe, we have 28 IP POPs across Europe, and this map's actually already a little bit old. We're also down in Sofia, as well as Bucharest. We have 92% of Western European eyeballs directly connected to the net, and I think, I'm looking at whether or not that included Poland in it. Yeah, so outside of basically the Russian border. 92% of European eyeballs in one hop, right? And that's how we get to the 1.76. A little bit about scale. We have actually about 280 on-net buildings in Europe and are looking to grow that. And in terms of traffic volumes, we do around about a terabit per second in billable edge traffic in Europe alone. We do about 1.6 in North America. We have 2.6 terabits per second of customer-facing port capacity, 640 gig of interfaces with our peers just in Europe alone, 480 gig of IP TA capacity dedicated to IP. And we're actually on the transport layer. I think we have access to 7 different transatlantic networks. And we use a mixture of our owned and leased infrastructure to make sure that we have diversity across the Atlantic. But we are, I think, beyond confident that we're the largest IP network in terms of TA capacity on the planet. And an interesting statistic I did some analysis on the other day is that 65% of our traffic is on-net to on-net, which, as I said, gives us unmatched control over our SLAs. I'll give you another statistic, which is really interesting. 73% of the traffic we serve to ISPs originates either from other customers or from our CDN. Right? So that is truly powerful in terms of ability to control quality. From the IP base, though, as I said, around about 2007, 2008, we started asking ourselves the question, well, this is great. We've gotten ourselves to being a very, very large network. And there's no doubt about it, we've been very successful in that space. But Level 3 has always been a very forward-thinking business, and it started asking itself, well, what does it need to do next? And what is the future of internet transit delivery? And our view very quickly came to the fact that we needed to add to our transit CDN capability. And the notion being here, it's a mix of what's good for us, it's a mix of what's good for our customers, it's a mix of what's good for the ecosystem in general. As traffic becomes more local, we need more capacity to be able to serve it more locally. It's also pretty inefficient when you think about it to have people in Poland or Kazakhstan pulling stuff from San Jose, right? It just didn't make an awful lot of sense, especially as the traffic volumes grow. So partly for that pure fundamental engineering efficiency point of view, we formed the view that the CDN was the right thing to do. The second thing we realized, of course, was that there was a whole host of services required by content companies that plain vanilla transit just wasn't doing a good enough job at. And so if you could merge those things together, you could actually create a dynamic ecosystem where you're managing cost, you're improving quality to ISPs as well, lower latency, less failovers, right? Less things like reroutes in the middle of secure TCP sessions, right? All these sorts of things are fundamental to enhancing the customer experience in the ISP level. There was also a huge benefit to content providers, right? Particularly as a lot of content providers have to deal with things like flash crowds, right? Do you really want to build an infrastructure large enough for dealing with the demand that you have 2 or 3 days a year, right? We heard this morning from Allegro how basically already, the peakiness of traffic does strain you a little bit in terms of having power boxes when 70% of the time they're not used. That's pretty painful to do. What you can do with a CDN, of course, is you're sharing that capacity with a bunch of other people, collective buying, costs go down. All in all, a very important thing. Also increased resilience and redundancy. The product suite today is constantly evolving. CDN isn't really one product. In fact, we have a number of different product managers that each deal with the different facets of it. We do HTTP caching, which is pretty obvious. Move networks and Microsoft Smooth Streaming, which are kind of hybrid streaming, progressive download applications. Windows Media Serving and Flash Media Serving streaming. We also have origin storage and extended library content. So we have a tiered architecture. We have centralized origin nodes, I think 2 in Europe, going out to a number of sort of tier 2 CDNs that ultimately feed tier 3 clusters and caches. And that way we can always make sure that depending on the popularity of content, depending on the efficiency of distributing it more closely, we can match it to the appropriate place. And so therefore, if you think about it, your customer, if you're an ISP, is getting that content, very quickly if other people are asking for it, and not so quickly if they aren't, and that's an appropriate use of bandwidth and resource. I'll talk a little bit about Vivix in a minute, but on top of all this, and well, underneath it is the intelligent traffic management module that makes sure that we load balance effectively, and an awful lot of web applications that are designed about satisfying our content customers to be able to tell them where the content is, why it's going, where it's going. The other thing I'd point out is there's a lot of encoding. There's a lot, as I said, there's a lot of service around this that content companies, and particularly broadcasters, demand. Right? They're used to running networks that cannot fail, right? Not networks that have SLAs. In fact, the Vivix business that we own, which does point-to-point video broadcast, doesn't have an SLA. Because the SLA is it must not break. Right? If it breaks, you need to fix it as soon as possible. Right? You can't sit there and say, I'm going to wait till my 8 minutes come up, because then it starts costing me money. So what you can see then is the collection of from infrastructure to transport. We do sell dark fiber, mostly in metro routes at the moment, not so much in the long haul, although on isolated occasions. Co-location business, which is phenomenally successful for us. On the transport layer, we do, obviously waves. Wavelengths is our core bread and butter in the transport layer. Private line, Ethernet private line, metro, transoceanic, data and Ethernet, a whole host of other different things. Ethernet virtual private line. And some of this is about supporting our US corporate customers in Europe, which is a segment we don't really target today. But then in the IP and CDN space, we have the #1 IP network with the CDN bolted into it and operating, within it. And last but not least, Vivix. And as I said, Vivix is our point-to-point video transport network. And what Vivix, we've been growing this into Europe. It's connected to a bunch of stadiums and event locations. It carries things like the Super Bowl, Major League Baseball, the Democratic National Convention, all sorts of stuff. And where we go with this, and you can hopefully see, this is our most expensive slide to produce, is a cradle-to-grave or creation-to-consumption view of what it takes to shift bits. And this, to us, is fundamental to the evolution of the Internet, right? You pick up the content over here, and you're going to pull it straight out of the stadium. Sorry, this is obviously an American slide, as we don't see that many baseball stadiums in Europe. But skateboard parks, we see a few more. Picking up live feeds, taking them through the production cycle in media, taking them to multiple post-editing locations where ads can be added into them, commentary, maybe different language commentary in certain locations. Even in the United States, there are regional flavors to the same thing being broadcast, right? Sometimes it's actually regional accents as well as regional adverts because of localization in advertising. From Vivix, we can then take it to one of our broadcast encoding centers where we can turn it into a number of different IP-based technologies. We can feed that IP-based stream back out to an end customer if they want to be their own origin storage and they want to be their own deliverer of this sort of stuff. Or we can take it back out into our IP cloud and ultimately feed it to customers wherever they may be, right? And those customers may be regionally specific because quite a bit of content is geo-blocked, but it could be global. And we've done a number of global events in terms of we broadcast the the inauguration of President Obama into the United Kingdom by taking it over Vivix to our broadcast encoding center, then encoding it, bringing it across Europe into our CDN, and then feeding it out to all of the ISPs in the UK. The size of the backbone required, by the way, just again, another metric is we currently have a throughput of over 20 petabytes of traffic a day, which is, the last time I calculated, equivalent to 1,020,000 gig movies a day. But the size of those movies is dramatically changing. And so that, to me, I mean, as a picture, and to us as a business, says to us, vertical integration matters, service quality matters, and you need to be good at operating every single layer of these things to be able to make money and to be able to provide the quality of service that your customers demand. What are we delivering today? So here's some interesting statistics as traffic comes online. This is, sorry, it's probably a little bit small for you guys to see. This is some work from Analysis Mason. It's about the change in media consumption habits. And this is the number of minutes per day that the average, I think, Western European consumer, retail person spends consuming different types of media. And we've got, TV, linear TV, and then basically everything on the web here today in 2008. Relatively small percent, maybe around about 10%, including the time they spend on the traffic and time they spend on the web and the traffic associated with TV. As that changes over time, you'll see two things. Number one, there isn't actually a hell of a lot of growth in the number of hours people spend consuming media. And if you think about that, we sleep 8 hours a day. We go to work 8 hours a day. There's, cleaning, cooking, all the regular things to do in life. There isn't actually that much space left to be able to consume media. And I think the reality is we consume about as much media today in terms of, pure hours spent as is possible. What we see, I think, here in that trend of slight growth is about colonization of time where you weren't capable of consuming video or audio media, right? In the sense that if you can now stream a movie while you're on the bus, when once upon a time you were reading a newspaper, then that's new space for video to be able to expand into. It's probably not actually a total growth in the total media consumption market. I think some of this is replacement, right? But nevertheless, what we see from Analysis Mason's view, at least from 2008 to 2018, is a world where linear television broadcast drops from being 90% to around about 20%, right? And what gets put in its place is a mix of stuff. It's on-demand streaming, it's premeditated streaming, it's watching linear TV but over the internet, and it's other bits and bombs around peer-to-peer file sharing and things like that, but that may or may not replace. I think that's the kind of alternative piece. Overall, the trends are, though, that almost all TV will be on demand and consumed over IP networks. And the majority of content will be HD ready by 2018, and I think we see this hugely in our streaming business. When we stream content in high definition, the dwell times are like 3 to 4 times what they are when it's standard def, right? So when you think about the impact of that on networks, it's profound, right? More pronounced shift to broadcasting linear content over IP. I think we'll see more and more of that. Specialist independent channels. So this is Analysis Mason's findings. I'm still a little bit dubious about this. I think we're still discovering whether or not this world of online media means that everything fragments into a million channels. Fundamentally, I think in most societies and cultures, TV consumption is a shared experience. So the time might get spread out. I watched it at 10 in the evening, you watched it at 7 in the evening. But fundamentally, we want to both have watched that program so that we can discuss it by the water cooler at work the next day, right? And last but not least, peer-to-peer is declining. Now there's a question point whether or not it's actually declining in absolute terms or just declining in relative terms. I think to me it's very clear it's declining in relative terms. In absolute terms, we're maybe just at the cusp. From what I can see of this data, when I take a look at it, there's certainly a trend where I think the more data that is available through legitimate sources, simultaneously with the more governments run around and threaten to sue people or cut them off from the internet if they continue to use peer-to-peer, we are going to see peer-to-peer decline over time. And that is probably beneficial to a lot of people in the industry. It also has a knock-on effect, though. And one of the knock-on effects it has on an ISP's network is that a typical ISP sends out as much traffic, half as much traffic as they receive, right? Sort of 2 to 1 in terms of in and out flows. And the bulk of that outflow is peer-to-peer, right? So as peer-to-peer declines, the uplink is going to be even more underutilized, right? In terms of size of data being consumed, I think 1 minute of medium quality video equates to around about 7 to 10 megabytes of data, and we will be expecting 2 megabits per second per broadband line by 2018, an average annual growth of 55%. And I actually personally think that 55% may even be a little bit low. I don't know what the typical bandwidth per broadband subscriber in Poland is. I'm going to guess somewhere between 70 and 100. I know it varies, kilobits per second. It varies dramatically depending on network. Access networks, the cable networks tend to have a higher one, very restrained. IP stream type resellers tend to try and have a much lower one because it's expensive, but it's important. Unleashing the impact of that change in time consumption and the change in the bandwidth per application, we have a graph that is, depending on your point of view, either liberating or terrifying. And it's liberating if you think about the fact that you're going to be able to do so much stuff online and you're never going to have to watch a boring program again. And I can't wait for that day. But it also means that the network burden is going to be phenomenal. Now, is it phenomenal compared to where we've come from? Possibly not. I mean, we've dealt with curves like that before as an industry. Right? But it is still nonetheless challenging, and it's certainly challenging to manage from a cost perspective. And that's the same graph again as a percentage. And here you can see peer-to-peer declining from around about 50% of traffic today to hopefully, well, relatively small, depending on your point of view. Bit about timing. Timing's important because obviously when you need to spend the money is, from the time value of money perspective, an important determinant to how much it actually is going to cost. Will your customers wait? The evidence we see is that they won't, right? They are demanding access to this stuff. If you look at growth in online, and this is data from ComScore Videometrics, growth from 2008 to 2009 in the United States was 113% in time per month watching video streams over the internet. Right? And an I think the 87% is also the number of online video properties growth. So this is about more media companies pushing more stuff onto the web. We're all familiar with YouTube. We all handle a lot of YouTube traffic, I presume. YouTube's growth rate over the last 3 years has been 129% CAGR, right? Going from whatever it was, 100 million video streams a day in July of '06 to 1.2 billion per day 3 years later, which is something, again, when we do internal long-term forecasting, there's always someone in finance or strategy who sits and says, this can't continue, right? I mean, eventually it just starts to peter out, right? But it's Moore's Law, right? Fundamentally, we all resell access to Moore's Law boxes. And unless Moore's Law breaks, there's no evidence that actually that there is any maximum amount of bandwidth. There's always just the next application that comes along and uses it. And this is what we think the next 3 years are about. So at this point, I'm going to multimedia this a little bit. Hopefully this will work because I was having issues with my PC before. But I'm going to show you a quick movie from one of the
factors and challenges I see in the future of the evolution of the CDN space is that of scale, is that of traffic volume. It fits again well with some of the challenges and philosophy we had in level 3 over the years. CDN we really view as an enabling technology to take the internet to the next step of really providing all communications between end users, between humans. That's really we view that part of level 3's core mission is to provide communication between eyeballs of all sort, of all bandwidths. And we really view that there's a change occurring in the marketplace today as we see broadcast video and other videos moving onto the internet at a scale beyond what the internet's seen before. Now, we've seen these problems before in terms of meeting the scale, being able to double our traffic every year for the last 20 years is what the industry's been doing, so I'm sure we can accomplish it. But I'd say that is one area where there's a challenge. And one of the big areas in the challenge is going to be how well CDN providers can interconnect with the eyeball networks. And again, it's the network connectivity side. If you go look at the demand generated from the video side, we could go out and buy a bunch of servers to generate that demand. It's really, to generate that amount of traffic, I'm sorry. It's really in the area of delivering it to the end users that you need to make sure you have the right infrastructure and the connectivity. And it's more of a business relationship issue that I see than a technical relationship, which is good, because a lot of the technology is out there to scale the last mile. It's a question of, can you make the economics work rationally? And
Joe actually gave away our secret plan, which is, if there isn't sufficient demand, we'll just generate it ourselves internally. But, I'm only kidding. But so fundamentally what we have is the internet's not going to break. Okay? The amount of capacity in wholesale networks is huge. Right? The amount of capacity in CDNs is huge. The issue, and in fact, to be honest, we can serve that increased demand at ever lower prices as long as we do our job of making sure that we manage down our unit costs, which is what all of us in the wholesale side of the business have to do, and it's what we've always been successful. But we hit a brick wall, and I don't know whether or not my comedy sound effect is going to work, but fundamentally, our brick wall and my concern to the wholesale business is we have to help access networks to be able to handle this volume of traffic. And if we don't, we have a problem, right? And we all have a problem. I have a problem as a wholesale provider. The ISP doesn't necessarily have a problem, but he doesn't exactly have the most satisfied customer base. The content company's got a problem because he needs to get online, right? He knows that this is the future. And if we can't collectively solve this, we have huge issues. So we started doing some work trying to analyze what the cost structure of a typical ISP is today. And this may, again, it varies dramatically depending on the end network. I've used data from a bunch of different companies, ISPs, and regulatory resources to try and deconstruct what the typical one is. And what we see is, I'll give you a number here, right? The typical Western European ISP network spends around about $20 US per month per line on network infrastructure. Sounds high, right? But the reality is, for an awful lot of companies, they're operating at bugger all margin, or very little. The companies that can afford to spend a heck of a lot of money on marketing are the ones that have got, quad play and whatever else infrastructure, in which case a large amount of that stuff is going over this network. If you deconstruct what the cost to an ISP delivery is and why this matters in terms of those growing volumes, what you typically see is around about 50% is the access network, okay? And that can be, local unbundling fees. It can be the operation, the cost of operating your cable infrastructure, and it can be, the amortized cost of your DSLAMs. It's expensive, okay, but it doesn't move as volumes grow, okay? So that's okay. Thank goodness we can breathe a little bit easier. Transit and peering infrastructure, in the meanwhile, and I go back to that contention ratio and how much bandwidth you actually provision for your lines, right, is if you're feeding the typical European eyeball, 50 kilobits per second, right, you're probably spending around about 2.5% of your total network expenditure on your peering and transit costs combined, right? So that's, buying waves to get to AM6 links and D6 or PLX. It's the cost of paying those areas for the facilities, and it's the cost of buying transit, and hopefully buying transit more closely to you than those peering exchanges, because otherwise there's really relatively little point in us being in the business. The thing, and that grows, that does have to grow a little bit in terms of, although I would say different areas of this, so peering has a different price erosion curve than transit. Transit's price erosion curve is quite profound, and so that's one thing. 47.5%, though, is also variable cost, right? And that's the internal network cost, okay? And that's the cost of, it's a lyric type cost, it includes amortization, but it's the cost of your own fiber rings around your own country. It's the cost of the DWDM equipment that you're having to deploy and constantly upgrade. It's the cost of the routers. Last but not least, if you're a DSL unbundler, it's the cost of expensive leased lines to get from your own metro pops down to however many hundreds or thousands of local exchanges that you need to get to. And those circuits are typically pretty expensive, right? All of this rises with rising bandwidth, right? And to me, when I sit here and I say to myself, everybody needs it cheaper, everyone needs it cheaper. If we gave that piece away for free, 1 month's growth would eat it, right? So we can argue about the cost of transit, we can argue about the cost of peering, but the simple fact of the matter is that ain't what's killing ISPs. That's what's killing ISPs, right? And unless that issue is addressed, I go back to we all as an industry have a problem, which is that basically the economics of this don't work. So I want to talk a little bit about ISP architectures. When I first did the work on this, we decided to call it, when is an IP network not an IP network? And what was amazing is I went around talking to a number of ISPs about being able to connect to them more deeply. How could we collectively work with them to be able to lower some of that 47.5%? I hit this brick wall. And I hit the brick wall that basically said, yeah, I've only got BRASs in 2 locations. So actually, where you give me the traffic today, that's as far as I can take it. I sat there and scratched my head saying, hang on a second, walk me through that. And fundamentally, for most ISPs, and this is where I'm going to break into the third media, if you got 2 houses, I have wanted to do this for so many years, right? And a ring, right? And let's say you've got, I don't know how to draw a diagram for a BRAS. Let's put that there, right? Maybe interconnect. I'll skip the second half of it, right? If traffic between 2 houses on the same DSLAM, right? Let's assume they want to exchange traffic. The traffic typically goes all the way up to there to come all the way down for a number of networks. And interestingly enough, I've discovered a large number of people who are installing MSANs, IP-aware versions of DSLAMs, have decided that it's quite difficult to actually enable the IP awareness in them in a sense and allow them to locally settle traffic. So the BRAS still ends up, because of network control issues, being deeply involved in even the most localized traffic flows. So that, to me, is an issue. And the other thing that you see around this is the amount of traffic being hopping from box to box for no obvious reason. So what we have is we have centralized interconnect points with maybe 1 or 2 points out here to the peering exchanges of the transit providers. We have a network that really was designed to be able to take traffic from anywhere and give it to anywhere, being used for fundamentally unidirectional flows now. I mean, even peer-to-peer, which actually could be settled locally within your network, is generally not, right? The peers that people are exchanging these files with are actually in São Paulo. They're not, in Poznan. You have centralized BRASs breaking the IP network so that it isn't actually an IP network at all. Expensive router hops, and fundamentally somewhat inefficient transport usage. I spoke to an ISP the other day, who will remain nameless for obvious reasons, who told me that his routers around here are so busy passing traffic back and forth between each other, he's eaten every port. He hasn't got any room for ports to be able to drop off or pick up traffic. He's not a small ISP, so I'm suspecting he's not the only person that's had that issue, right? So when we go back to the question, how do we enable more video? There's a bunch of this architecture that needs to change. So what do a number of ISPs try and do about it? First answer, peer it all. Let's get that 1.25% that's on transit to be lowered so that we can actually have an incremental cost of theoretically zero at a peering exchange. Peering has an important role to play in the infrastructure and in the ecosystem, and I completely agree with that. As much as it's probably a breach of my contract to say that, come on, it's true, right? It is very true. But fundamentally, where I sit and question this a little bit is a focus on peering ignores the 47.5%. It's addressing the wrong problem, right? So the problems with peering are obviously you have to build an international network, constant political battles. I may be overstating that. I'm sure you all have very friendly discussions about your peering interconnects at all times, but they can at times be heated, right? Reliance on single interconnect points and hot potato receive. So I go back to here, right? Now you're receiving all of your traffic or a significant portion of it, like miles away, way outside your domestic footprint. Right? And having to carry it all back because the whole nature of a peering relationship says, hey, if we're peers and I'm not getting paid for it, I am giving it to you as quickly as I possibly can. Right? So I would say, that is basically, to a certain extent, can extend the issue. Not entirely. It's useful for certain elements. Right? I would posit transit's obviously been very cost effective when compared to the true cost of peering today. Lets you control the traffic by cold potato and reduces international network management and is also, fundamentally less hassle. But I agree. I would say that. So I'll move on to the next point. Here's another thing I hear from a lot of ISPs. Boy, those content guys keep on sending traffic into my network. They should be paying me, right? Which goes down the lines of sort of two things. It says, well, we need to find a way to make content pay, right? And my view is, in a lot of conversations that I've witnessed about this across the industry, right, is the content didn't send the traffic into your network. Your subscriber did. They requested it in the first place, right? So the issue is somewhere slightly different. It's a little bit of a disingenuous argument. So there's two approaches to how do we make content pay, because none of us like blackmail, right? But so we go down two different roads typically in the industry. We've seen quasi architectures, right? Where you say, well, okay, I need a product to sell to content customers for them to be willing to pay me. It's going to be one of two things. It's either going to be quasi or CDN. If I do quasi, what I'll do is I'll basically put a better tag, a faster tag, on content that comes from a content company that pays me, right? So I guess the first problem I have with it is that's actually quite expensive to implement inside an ISP's network, okay? That's at your 47.5% and it just grew it, right? I'm not entirely sure who's going to pay for this in terms of the content guys, and here's the reason why, right? If a regular network is fine, and it should be, right, then why would I need to pay to tag it to get better delivery? Unless what you're saying is actually if I don't tag it and I don't pay you, then you're going to hamstring my ability to deliver traffic into your network. Now hang on a second, I'm not sure I like the sound of that. And dear subscribers, right, The slightly subtler version of this is, well, we'll build a CDN into our network. That way we turn it into a value-added service wrap, right? Content company's going to be thrilled to give me money now because I'm solving so many problems. There was a reason why I went through a bunch of the stuff at the beginning about Vivix, encoding, international footprint, service wraps, software, management tools, all that kind of stuff. It's hard work building a CDN. Trust me, we know. And not to say it's not worth it, but it's a lot of work. We started out by buying, I think, 150 patents from Savis. And by the time we sat there reading through all of them and saying, gosh, this is what's involved in it, it was quite a head-spinning exercise. I also have a little bit of a struggle with a model that says ISPs should each build their CDNs. Is how many ISPs do we expect content companies to be willing to contract with, right? They come to CDNs and they say, listen, I want 1, maybe 2. I don't want 27 because I have customers in 27 countries, right? I just want to be able to get there. I want to be able to pay one guy, right, or girl. Huge servicing issues, right? These are difficult, high-quality, conscious customers. As I said about the Vivix SLA, there isn't one. It has to be that good, right, that there isn't even an SLA. And last but not least, the same issues I raised about quals apply to an ISP building their own CDN, which is, what are we saying about traffic that doesn't come off the CDN, right? So, okay, I've gotten a quote from you, Mr. ISP. You're going to charge me X for CDN, and one of the other CDNs is going to charge me less. Am I going to see a diminished ability to deliver traffic into your network if I don't buy from you? So again, we're back into that whole, it sounds a little bit like, more of a threat than an inducement at times, right? And as I said, what about the 20 vertically integrated products that the content customer wants? I'm going to draw one other diagram on the board, okay, because this is important to me. I keep on coming across this issue. Well, but the content guys, they're making so much money, particularly those broadcasters. Look at those broadcasters. They print money, okay? If you look at, I'm going to erase diagram number 1. If you look at, I'm going to go back to my typical ISP. So my typical ISP, and I'm going to use UK numbers again just because I find it easier to read their accounts and whatever else. They have a cost in the ISP base that looks like, in fact, I won't name names here, but I mean, so the point being, if you have 3 million subscribers and they're paying you £20 a month or whatever, it's not difficult to have a €2 billion business here per annum, right? Typically making 20% EBITDA margins. And, spends a phenomenal 30% on marketing, and they do that just to stand still, because the second you stop advertising, you start losing customers, and around about 30% of their revenue on network costs of one sort and another, right? And then there's SG&A in here, right? Now let's take a look at a large broadcaster, okay? Large broadcaster in the UK, I'll use ITV because they publish their accounts, right? They spend a chunk of money on marketing. Okay, right? They spend a chunk of money on buying or producing their own content, right? So actually filming, sending people out to go and do stuff. They have SG&A just like you do. And they also make about 20% EBITDA margins. See the problem here? They can't pay for that. The businesses are the same size. Right? There's no way content is going to turn around and start handing ISPs billions of dollars to build infrastructure. It doesn't work with their business model. The reason why these guys are struggling as they get online is because the incremental cost of an incremental eyeball on broadcast is nil. Right? The incremental cost of an eyeball in ISP land or in CDN land, it's money because there's increased network burden and somebody has to charge. And this is why I go back to my fundamental tenet saying, we got to solve that problem collectively, right? Oh. For the sake of a clean board. Clean that up. And I promise that's the last I'll do of my impersonation of a professor. So, I guess last but not least, what I'd say is there's some things that we could be trying here, right, as an industry. I would say things you can't control. Eyeballs cost traffic, content doesn't. Get over it. I mean, it really is important that we be more adult about this. You need to be capable of growing volumes in an open world. Because as soon as we start going down these closed worlds, the QAS, CDN, anything that contemplates, a notion of exclusivity, a walled garden. Walled gardens don't work. It's not what anyone's subscribers want, right? But what you can control is make your network more capable of handling inflows deeper into your network, right? or as I'd say in transit speak, cold potato your way to happiness, right? And without me redrawing the diagram of typical ISP's network, here's a notion that's even more adventurous, right? When you think about that ISP that's spending all of his router ports just handing traffic between his backbone routers without any of them picking up or dropping off customer traffic, you could be engaging with, wholesale providers like ourselves to be able to actually do something we call an express lane, which is, give dedicated transport links, and they can be diverse, right? So we can make sure we have all the failover issues solved back from each metro node, right? And announce more specific routes to us. And so therefore, you don't have to carry stuff over 6 router hops to get to your end router, right? Have the end router connected back. I'm not saying break the paradigm of having an IP network. You do both simultaneously. It works. It substantially reduces the amount of infrastructure that you need, particularly because, as I say, fundamentally, IP clouds are about traffic that comes from anywhere and goes to anywhere and all the time and etc. The future of this stuff is unidirectional. Right? It wants to be broadcast, in a sense, right? And that's what the challenge is in terms of cost. Last but not least, something we've also been talking to a number of ISPs about, but this is, again, by no means market ready, but I figured because this is a technical conference, I'm given some license to imagineer a great, brave future, is work with CDNs, wholesale providers, other guys, to be able to put their caches into your network, right? Because, as I say, it's going to save you all the money of putting your own CDN in the network, but actually they know what they're doing. They know how to operate it. They have those customer contracts. It makes sense. It does actually allow for a win-win network. Point one above being a prerequisite in the sense that there's no point in putting 20 CDN clusters in your network if all the traffic is going to go back up to the VRAS before coming down again, right? So that needs to be solved. So I think I'm running out of time, but hopefully I've gotten, here's my second comedy sound effect, which is that fundamentally, we need to break down the walls and barriers. The biggest issue, as I say, to growing volumes is within ISP's network. If we, as an industry, can collectively address this, then we'll all have a great time serving video for years to come. Whoops. One needs to move off the sound effect. That was just to check you were all still awake. So, conclusions. Sure, focus on peering, and it does make sense, and it has an appropriate place in the ecosystem, as does transit, I hope you all believe. But fundamentally, my point being, don't worry about that 2.5%, whether or not you're spending it on transport infrastructure to a peering exchange or whether or not you're spending it on transit. The 2.5% isn't going to move the needle, right? Want to build your own CDN? Really, I wouldn't encourage it unless you have considerable scale. Likewise, the quals argument, both of these arguments because of the blackmail element, which causes me great concern. But what you can do is design your network to take feeds locally. Okay? Work with interconnecting parties to lower the number of equipment hops each bit in your network makes. A great phrase that I heard from Joe Lawrence actually in the video was, if the problem is cost, complexity is unlikely to be the solution. Right? And so it's worth bearing that in mind. Right? And don't convince yourself that somebody else should pay for the problem. They won't, right? So, as I've discussed, I think the content tsunami, as we call it, is real. It is here. It is happening to you as we speak. We think, it takes a very broad skill set to be able to address and handle these. Fundamentally, the internet isn't going to break as a consequence of it. It's edge networks that are going to feel the most strain. It's not even edge content providers, right? Because content providers have been earlier to embrace things like CDN to the extent possible. Not all applications easily lend themselves to being CDN hosted, but over time, CDNs will get better and capable of hosting more dynamic applications. But the issues are basically to be dealt with at the access network layer and the interconnect. That's about it. So thanks ever so much for your time. And I think I ran a couple of minutes over, but do we have time for some questions or no?
Not at all.
No?
Sorry.
Okay.
Thank you.
Talk to that one.
Tak, nie będziemy robić przerwy i od razu zaczynam z tą prezentację.